In the beginning, it was a wish. It had to be a wish. It's the only paradise perishable humans can have. For thousands of years, humans' wishes perished, but one reached a star. That was a miracle, more so because the star was a very good one. The star answered the humans and descended to Earth. Then, everything began. A star that was curious about humans pretended to be human, then became one. The humans saw its splendor and called it an angel. Although its form was the same, its substance was different. The undying substance, the breath of metal that lives forever. That is the reason humans wished for an angel. The angel gladly shared immortality with humans, but that blessing wasn't for everyone. An angel's gift was something humans dare not enjoy. Many humans died without hope in their hearts, and the ones who lived harbored rage instead of death. Eventually, humans destroyed and burned their hope on their own. This is how the angel became the god, torn to death. This tale, the tale of the one-winged angel, is of paramount importance in the land of Krat. It's unclear from whence the story originated, but we do know that it probably isn't as far-fetched as it may at first seem. Some speculate that the star told of in legend fell to Earth in the western part of Krat itself, as it was here, long ago, that an extraordinary discovery would be made, one which would heavily influence the trajectory of the land's future. No one knows when the inorganic cluster structure called Crowd sunk its roots in Krat. The first documented record is 600 years ago, when there was a ground collapse in the west of Krat. The people who collected the bodies of the farmers and mules who died found unknown minerals and ruins at the bottom of the pit, but they didn't know their value at the time. Likely named for the place in which it was first discovered, Crowd was an inorganic composite without clear origin, appearing most regularly in tough, rocky formations which protruded upward toward the heavens. Crowd was intriguing, but not altogether important or even functional for most of history. For hundreds of years, it would continue to be found in the land, but with hardly anyone equipped for its serious study, the substance would go untapped. Nevertheless, many would speculate that Crowd and the Star of Legend may just be interlinked, and indeed, there was one group in particular who would make their way to the land in order to investigate that very possibility for themselves. One day, the Alchemists, a mysterious, pseudo-religious order from an island outside of Krat, made their way to the township. Led by a man called Valentinus Monad, the Alchemists were interested in the study of life and of immortality. Recently, they had come into possession of an important and holy artifact, one that was directly related to the tale of the one-winged angel itself, and which may have been deliberately left for them against their knowledge by their former member, the legendary Philippus Paracelsus, acting under the order of a different and equally enigmatic faction. That item in question was known as the Arm of God, and as its name suggested, it was the leftmost appendage of the deity mentioned in the myth. Realizing what they had, the alchemists understood that the artifact held great potential toward furthering their goals, and so they had followed the legend in hopes of further discovery. At the time, Krat was but a humble fishing village, but the St. Frangelico Cathedral, Krat's dominant place of worship, held some amount of authority in town. The cathedral was headed by Archbishop Andreas, a man said to possess a moral influence strong enough to cause even murderers to repent for their sins. He was, by all accounts, a beloved man, and it was said that when the alchemists arrived, they met with him and the citizens of Moonlight Town, the lowest area in all of Krat, to propose an agreement. The alchemists offered, in return for their accommodation, that they would invest a portion of their wealth into Moonlight Town and the surrounding area, allowing for renovation and a higher standard of living. All that they asked in return was the ability to pursue their studies unfettered. And seeing this as an opportunity to lift Krat out of poverty, the Archbishop and the people agreed to these terms. Before long, the alchemists' main area of focus would be a subterranean system, packed densely with Crowd, known as the Relic of Trismegistus. It's not exactly clear what, if anything, the name says of the location, but etymologically, it seems to suggest that the cavern or its contents were believed to have been left by someone or something thrice the greatest. The implication may be that the complex is of a significant age, or of ultimate divinity. Perhaps it's even a bit of both. Regardless, the Relic of Trismegistus would quickly become the single largest and most significant source of Crowd in all of Krat, but the value of Crowd itself was rather quickly determined not to be in the whole of the material, but rather in one of its component substances, Ergo. Small blue motes occurring as spores or more dense crystalline structures, Ergo was a massively potent energy source, with applications certainly worth exploring for ones such as the Alchemists, who may have initially taken taken some of the substance back to their isle, upon which sat the Ark Abbey, a colossal building made to serve the faction's primary endeavors. Quote, "The Ark Abbey was built for a covert and lofty purpose. Wake up, evolve, ascend." This was the alchemist's ardent wish. However, the presence of Ergo would also affect the alchemist's most prestigious family in a peculiar way. Valentinus's wife, Isabel Monad in particular, was what would come to be called a listener, a person capable of hearing voices within Ergo and even manipulating the substance in some limited fashion. Unfortunately, it's said that such a gift caused Isabel much undue stress, with her coming to refer to it as
the devil's power,
and resulting in the ability becoming a closely guarded Monad family secret. As their name gained further prestige, due in part to their charitable contributions to the city, such as the creation of the Monad Charity House, an orphanage and boarding school to serve less fortunate children, the family would do their best to bury any notion of Isabel's listener status. But all of the secrecy in Krat wouldn't prevent their daughter, Sophia Monad, from being cut of the same cloth. Sophia also possessed the abilities of a listener, and knew from whom she inherited them, but it's unclear whether her mother knew of Sophia's gift in turn. Sophia was smart, after all, and quickly realized it was best to keep such powers to herself. Meanwhile, the alchemists at large had begun experimentation and continued research into Ergo. Each passing year brought new advancements, and as the scale of their operation grew, they would begin offering gold and riches to the archbishop directly in order to ensure the church's continued endorsement, which, for a time, mustn't have been a difficult bribe to accept, considering all of the wonderful things that the alchemists would continue to bring to Krat as a result. Of particular regard were the works of Giuseppe Geppetto, an alchemist, inventor, and engineer who would pioneer the technology of ergo-powered automata, which he dubbed puppets. Such machines would soon become standard in everyday life within the city, and Geppetto himself constructed puppets for all manner of utility, quickly rising to fame as one of the most successful and accomplished men in all of Krat. However, as time went on, it became increasingly apparent that there was an unknown aspect to puppet technology which few could explain rationally. It started with a maid puppet named Camille, who in spite of having no such directive, caught a human child as it fell from its crib, and still others would exhibit similar, unorthodox behavior. Such puppets were said to develop an ego, a sense of self-awareness and sentience anomalous to everyone's understanding at the time. Such occurrences would be all but eliminated, however, when Geppetto and the Workshop Union, the overseers of puppet technology, would enact a protocol known as the Grand Covenant. This bit of programming was imbued into each puppet hereafter, and outlines the axes to which all puppets were henceforth beholden. It consisted of 4 paramount tenets.
The Grand Covenant is a set of absolute commands imprinted on puppets when they are made. First law: all puppets must obey their creator's commands. Second law: a puppet may not harm humans. Third law: a puppet protects and serves humans and the city of Krat. Fourth law: a puppet cannot lie.
But the emergence of puppet sentience had taught the alchemists something new as well, for they had learned, in the research of the ego-driven specimens, what Ergo truly was, that being a distillation of memory and time, essentially remnants of experiences left behind by conscious beings at the time of their death.
The essence is Ergo. Yes, the Ergo you use as your power was once a human being.
It was no mere mineral, and this also held some interesting implications for the listeners, Isabel and Sophia Monad, who, we now know, were, in a manner, hearing the voices of the dead. This realization would hardly deter the alchemists, though. Geppetto's inventions, crafted with a level of quality, care, and precision simply unattainable to other inventors, continued to garner massive praise, and within a short time, puppets and people lived together in Krat with equal facility. But while Geppetto's professional career was proving undeniably fruitful, the ramifications of his diligent commitment to Krat and its industrialization also placed a heavy strain on the man's personal obligations. Geppetto's son Carlo was far from a priority in his father's life. So obsessed was the inventor with his tinkering, in fact, that at an early age he sent the boy away to live and attend boarding school at the Monad Charity House. It was here that Carlo would meet the best friend of his life, a young man named Romeo, to whom he was introduced by Sophia Monad herself. Both boys boys shared a dream of becoming stalkers, mercenaries of some renown in Krat, who served the wealthy populace as bodyguards, fixers, and the like, a prospect which Carlo and Romeo found most exciting, and the two would converse and train toward their goal together. For a time, this would have offered Carlo a sense of belonging he'd never been shown before. Romeo was kind, shared his interests, and in a way, filled the role of family left vacant by Geppetto's indifference. But when, at the close of his school career, his father failed to attend Carlo's graduation, the boy's hurt and resentment burned with unmatched fervor. Enraged, Carlo confided in Romeo that he would not care even if Geppetto died, despite Romeo reminding him that he was lucky to have any family at all. Nevertheless, Carlo would give Romeo a necklace that had been presented to him by Geppetto in the past, a form of protest in its own right, and apparently continued to live in the charity house hereafter for some time, while making an effort to pursue a career as a stalker. At some point, Carlo would actually meet a stalker for himself, and begged her to teach him the way of the sword, but the request was swiftly denied. Around the same time, back in Ark Abbey, it seems that particularly daring alchemists had begun to experiment further with the arm of God, testing the effects of the relic upon themselves and puppets alike, in a step which proved to be something of a mistake. For these acts were most likely the cause of the Petrification disease, a mysterious and extremely dangerous illness that spreads throughout Krat, even in the modern day. This sickness took hold of the body in ways uncharacteristic of other diseases, making the blood turn blue and causing massive sores to erupt across the body. Fatality, even in these early phases, was common amongst the infected, but those who did not die were subjected to a fate that's perhaps even worse. The body would begin to harden, as if the flesh itself were turning to stone. The process was painful, cruel, and to make matters worse, nobody was entirely sure where it had come from. From here on out, the petrification disease would prove exceptionally dangerous, and warrant a period of quarantine whenever and wherever it would crop up. But it wasn't long until this hideous ailment would change the history of Krat forever. The Rose Estate incident is a case that remains very mysterious even to this day. It's an odd occurrence that took place at the Monad charity house, sometimes called the Rose Estate. The story goes that suddenly, a bout of petrification disease, introduced to the premises in an unknown manner, took hold of the residences. It's thought that nearly everyone present at the estate at the time was to have contracted the disease in some way, and proved too much for many of those who lived there to endure. Nobody was safe, from students to staff, and even the Monad family. And at the time, the Rose Estate incident was probably the largest outbreak of the disease that Krat had yet seen. Among the casualties was Valentinus Monad himself, with his passing undeniably dealing a massive blow to the Alchemists. His position as leader would soon be filled, however, by Simon Manus, a high-ranking member in his own right, and one of the men most devoted to unlocking the secrets of the Arm of God. In fact, Manus's motivation stemmed from more than simple interest, for he held a special and truly unique ability all his own. Simon Manus was able to read minds, but in his own words,
"Knowing the truth of people's minds is a curse."
Seeing the truth in all people made Manus a bitter and cynical man, a man who desired a world of complete and exclusive truth at all times, with his ultimate goal as an alchemist being not just to study the shattered god and the prospect of eternal life, but to become a god himself, and to reimagine humanity in his own twisted image of perfection, whether they wanted to ascend with him or not. There was, however, one person and one alone whom Simon Manus was truly fond of, a person whose plight he thought mirrored his own, someone who kept their supernatural gifts a secret, and which would be unbeknownst to even him were it not for his own extrasensory faculties. Shortly after the death of her father, Sophia Monad would be abducted by Manus and cloistered away in Ark Abbey against her will. The primary reason for her capture, according to Manus, was that he simply loved her, but it's also possible that her listener capabilities, especially her ability to manipulate Ergo, would have been taken as a valuable tool in the man's arsenal as he sought to enact his plan for perfection. But Valentinus was not the only notable death to occur at the Monad charity house. because also among the infected were Carlo and Romeo, with Carlo being the first to pass. It's hard to do justice to just how significant the death of Carlo was for the future of the city. It's undeniable that the death of his son simply broke something within Geppetto. It seems he suddenly began to understand the gravity of his negligence when it came to his relationship with the boy, which resulted in an inability to accept events as they had taken place. Geppetto, the genius inventor of Krat, couldn't simply allow the life of his son to slip away so easily. He was more clever than this, and if anyone could revive the dead, it was going to be him. From here, there was a stark change in Geppetto's focus when it came to inventing. Using everything he and the alchemists had learned about Ergo, Geppetto created the P organ, an artificial heart that could both house and sustain Ergo in such a way as to essentially store a person's consciousness. Using his invention, Geppetto was able to recover and secure the life essence of his son, but the organ could not be implemented into any old puppet. Carlo would need a specialized vessel, and so Geppetto got to work. The first attempt was, of course, imperfect. Tall, slender, and almost ghostly in both appearance and motion, this prototype, which is alleged to have been made from Carlo's own body, would become known as the Nameless Puppet. Quote, "The Nameless Puppet was the first puppet made by the old man that was mounted with a P organ. Its ergo efficiency was not just unremarkable, it was destructive. Thus, the Nameless Puppet was not chosen for the boy's body and sealed away. Despite being exempt from the Grand Covenant, as all puppets equipped with a P organ seem to be, the Nameless Puppet simply wouldn't suffice in its initial iteration. The key problem seemed to be the organ itself, which lacked a resilience that could only be achieved through the absorption of ergo, and so it seemed Geppetto would need to find a way to instigate ergo collection on a massive scale. Meanwhile, Simon Manus and the other alchemists had come to believe that the petrification disease was, in reality, a necessary step in the process of human evolution, and as such, they began to devise a serum that would not only cure, but harness the condition, turning the afflicted into instances of beings which can only be described as superhuman. Admittedly, given some of their successes, it's apparent that there were certainly potential upsides in store for those who were able to overcome the disease. Champion Victor, for example, grew to extraordinary size and demonstrated a strength unparalleled by mere man. But perhaps most impressive was the transformation of Sister Adriana, another alchemist baptized with the curative elixir who ascended to a state of near perfection and adopted the name Loxasia the Complete. One look at the highly publicized abilities of such subjects may have been enough to convince even the skeptical of the alchemist's cure. But to be cured, the populace would first need to be sick. When a new wave of the petrification disease hit Krat, it resulted in the largest and most potent outbreak of the plague before or since. It's unclear whether the disease was spread deliberately by the alchemists under Manus, or whether this instance of the spread came about by chance. But regardless, the pandemonium ensured that most citizens of Krat would turn to desperate means to secure treatment, and a good many of these citizens did not actually receive the treatment prepared by the alchemists at all, but rather one manufactured by a charlatan. At some point prior, a man named Clark Shore had somehow managed to steal a record of the alchemist's cure. Following its instructions, he began to produce the serum himself and marketed it under the alias of Dr. Cure-All. He seems to have been quite successful, with many citizens of the city turning to him for aid in their time of need. But little did they know that this tonic was defective. Though he believed himself to have perfectly followed the instructions, the so-called miracle cure hardly had the same effect as the original. There were no reports of miracle cure recipients developing any superhuman capabilities, nor of completely overcoming the petrification disease to begin with. Instead, these unfortunate souls would become carcasses, mindless, dead yet living beings, aimlessly wandering the land in search of something to attack and someone to spread the disease to. It was perhaps the area nearest the St. Frangelico Cathedral that was hit the hardest by these carcass monsters, and such evil, terrifying, and blasphemous creatures at last led Archbishop Andreas to acknowledge his foolishness for having let the alchemists take root in Krat all those 30 years ago. But the Archbishop wouldn't go down without a fight. He recruited Sister Cecile, a repentant murderer turned nun of the cathedral, to make her way to the Isle of the Alchemists and steal the arm of God, an act which he evidently believed would save the city from ruin through divine intervention. Quote, "I have their relic in my hands, thanks to Cecile. I won't let those bastards ruin Krat anymore. This will purify the city." Maybe it was a mistake to accept those guys from the beginning. This disaster was divine judgment. They should have been turned away all those 30 years ago. But this will be the end. Krat is a city blessed by God, and I, Andreas, will come to its rescue. However, despite his intentions, the arm of God began to transform Andreas, little by little, into a monstrous being all his own, one who came to dwell in the depths of the very same cathedral in which he once held worship. And to make matters worse, the Alchemists, or some other party, would eventually take back the arm, delivering it to Simon Manus once more. But while the city outside was stricken by both the onset of the Petrification disease and the effects of the cures, both authentic and otherwise, Geppetto was presented with a unique opportunity. When Carlo's old friend Romeo, whose body continued to harden, approached the old inventor with a request. Though he sought to save people and combat the terrible spread of the plague in whatever way he could, Romeo knew that his life was coming to an end, and therefore he would ask Geppetto to prolong his life by making his body and Ergo into the form of a puppet. A request which would be obliged under one condition. Geppetto's intent for Romeo from the onset was to make his son's best friend into the leader of all puppets, so that he may lead the charge in an unholy campaign of Geppetto's own devising. He had reasoned that the fastest, or perhaps the only way to collect the sheer volume of Ergo needed to continue honing his creations and to restore his son's life would be to source it from the city directly. In other words, Geppetto had planned for a fatal breach of the Grand Covenant, thus causing puppets to turn on humanity, killing them and siphoning away their Ergo. This would also serve to distract Simon Manus and the other alchemists, cutting them off from a large amount of Krat's Ergo in the process. Understandably, Romeo was not keen on this idea, but kept silent in his objection until his puppet transformation had been completed. He would have likely known, after all, that he was now in a unique position to mitigate the effects of the madman's ensuing plan. He would be the one to oppose the mad inventor as the head of the puppet resistance when the frenzy began. To put that plan into motion, Geppetto would leverage the Grand Covenant's hidden fifth law, or rather, its 0th law, deliberately kept secret from public knowledge and to be used in the case of an emergency scenario. Law 0 dictated that Geppetto himself had ultimate control of every puppet within the city, and when enacted, he would issue but one command: to kill. With this, the final piece of Geppetto's plan would be introduced. Within a train car retrofitted as a lab space housed within Krat Central Station, Geppetto would have been hard at work on Pinocchio, one of the finest and most intricate puppet specimens he'd ever created. The job of Pinocchio was to house Carlo's Ergo and cultivate both it and the P organ so that it may become nearly human, at which point the organ would be transplanted back into the nameless puppet, now tempered through the Ergo collection process, and completing the final, most pivotal step in the cycle of his son's rebirth. So began the events of Lies of P. One day, after the puppet's completion, Pinocchio was awakened by Sophia Monad, who reached out to them through the Ergo. The puppet made its way to Hotel Krat, a bastion which protected some of the city's only remaining humans. Here, Pinocchio met with some of the residents, as well as a visage of Sophia projected into the building by means of her Ergo manipulation. Sophia urged Pinocchio to pursue Geppetto, and so as quickly as it came, the puppet would depart again, finding the inventor in a carriage on Alchemist's Bridge, where he was being harassed by one of the city's remaining stalkers. After his creator's rescue, the puppet's adventures would take him across Krat, rescuing people such as Lorenzini Venigni, founder of the puppet production company Venigni Works, and slaying both carcass monsters and fellow puppets along the way. Unbeknownst to Pinocchio, many of the major puppets he would fell along the journey, such as the Parade Master and King's Flame Fuoco, would actually be acting under the authority of Romeo directly, and so without knowing the true nature of the puppet frenzy, they were slain. In fact, even Romeo himself would be defeated by Pinocchio in due time. After a brief detour into the barren swamp, though, Pinocchio returned to Hotel Krat to find it ransacked and Geppetto kidnapped. It was time to finish this. In the relic of Trismegistus, the place from which Ergo and all of the trouble it brought had stemmed, Pinocchio boarded a submersible and arrived on the shore of the Isle of Alchemists. Here, they also learned the truth behind Sophia's plight, before heading into Ark Abbey to face off against Manus and the imprisoned Geppetto. Ascending the building, Pinocchio would battle against Laxasia the Complete, before reaching Sophia's corporeal body. By now, the girl had been drained so thoroughly as to be physically unresponsive, yet, through Ergo, pleaded with the puppet to show her mercy by letting her die. Ultimately, the decision whether or not to go through with this is Pinocchio's to make. Regardless of what's done, the puppet would now face Simon Manus at the very top of Ark Abbey, who had now merged the arm of God with his own body. After beating him in what remains of his human form, the leader of the Alchemists would be born again in the form of the god torn to pieces, sprouting from his corporeal flesh, and at last setting into motion his dreams of a world devoid of untruth. But even the divine would be bested by Geppetto's puppet. Pinocchio would ultimately defeat the awakened god, dashing not only the man's vision for the world, but also the work of the entire alchemist sect. Now, there was only one thing to do. After rescuing Geppetto from where he was held in the abbey, the two would descend beneath the facility and meet at last under the abyss. The culmination of Geppetto's work was before him, and he would explain to his own creation that all of the components needed to revive Carlo were finally in place. The P organ within him had grown resilient throughout Pinocchio's adventures, resilient enough to be placed within the nameless puppet, and with the help of the arm of God, the process of resurrection was finally ready to begin. But there was still one final decision to be made, and that was, would Pinocchio give up his heart or fight to keep it? The former option sees Geppetto rend the heart from Pinocchio's chest and place it within the waiting vessel. With the transformation complete, both Carlo and Geppetto return to Hotel Krat, where it seems they transform the other residents into puppets themselves. It's undeniable that such events are not generally considered ideal. However, if Pinocchio was not as compliant, they'll be forced to do battle with the nameless puppet itself. Depending on some of the other choices that Pinocchio has made, such as whether or not they spared Sophia, or how many lies were told throughout their adventure, defeating the enemy can lead to one of two outcomes. In both, Geppetto brings himself between the blade of the nameless puppet and Pinocchio, just before it was to pierce the P organ, thus destroying Carlo's precious Ergo. This would be the end of the brilliant inventor, but if Sophia was shown mercy, and a high degree of humanity was achieved beforehand, there'll be another cutscene directly afterwards. We'll see Pinocchio, now more human than machine, return the Ergo of Sophia to a puppet body, so that maybe she can have a second chance on the life that she was robbed of. The future of Krat certainly seems unsure, but admittedly, things are made all the more uncertain by our last look into the world of Krat, the post-credit scene. Sometime in the near future, Philippus Paracelsus can be seen taking a phone call within a train car. Here, he speaks with another individual about retrieving the arm of God and speaking of the results of the so-called Krat experiment, leading to an assumption that every event to follow the alchemist's arrival in the city may have been orchestrated by his enigmatic order. But that's not all either, because Krat seemingly wasn't the only experiment of its kind.
I have a final report on the Krat experiment.
You certainly took your time, Paracelsus. Your findings?
I think we have a new brother. A new type of humanity, so to speak.
There are many forms of eternal life.
It's intriguing, and worth further observation.
Noted. And we'll have to get his arm back anyway.
I'm counting on it. Expect another report at the next meeting. Paracelsus returning. Ah, and when I return, I will find her. For sure. Another key of ours. Dorothy.
Make of all that what you will. And yeah, thus concludes today's overview of the lore and story of Lies of P, a game which I think I've had the most fun with out of any new experience I've played in quite a while. I've wanted to cover this game since before it came out, in fact, and I'm really glad to have finally gotten a chance to do so. There's so much to say about this world, and of course the lore I've offered here really only covers the basics and supplies a general outline of everything going on. Originally, I was going to do a video more in my traditional style, where I cover just one aspect of the world of Lies of P, but being a Souls-like, I felt that the story was so complex that maybe it warranted its own introductory or overview style video before I decide to go into detail on any one facet. Expect more Lies of P stuff on the channel too, because there's some pretty cool themes and elements of the story to go over here, and I think it'll definitely be worth a revisit. If you're into videos like this, and you're a fan of analyzing and overanalyzing complex lore and the nuances of storytelling in general, then I'd love to see you stick around. I cover a variety of different subjects on the channel, and I've got even more to explore in the near future. Also, we just passed 10,000 subscribers, which is massively flattering to me, and I really look forward to bringing you guys even more thought-provoking content, whether it be lore videos, story analyses, or just other stuff related to your favorite games. Let me know your thoughts regarding the world of Lies of P. Was there anything that you found particularly thought-provoking or interesting? Maybe there was something that you'd like to know more about, or something that I didn't talk about enough. I'll emphasize again that this certainly was not meant as a complete retelling of the story of the game, with all of its nuance and complexity intact. It's really just to serve as a jumping-off point for those who want to explore the world a little bit further. But as always, I hope it inspires you to pursue great stories for yourself, and maybe has you wanting to check out the game. It's definitely worth it. Judging by the post-credits scene, I think it's probably not going to be our only visit to the land of Krat, or at least the world in which Krat presides, so I look forward to seeing where this whole storyline goes, as well as what you have to say about it. That pretty much does it for me though, so with that, I'll catch you guys again soon in another video, and until then, this is Averberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.